All right, next up we have Bernd.
It's very good, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Who's the CEO of NetWays, and who will be talking about how convenience is killing open standards.
I think so, yes? Yeah, okay. So good morning. Thanks for being with us, being with me so early. I talk about how convenience is killing open standards. So just a super short introduction. My name is Bernd. I work for a German company named NetWays and a company named Isinga. We do monitoring. I'm from Nuremberg in Germany, and you can find me pretty much on Blue Sky better now. So I left X. You can find me on Blue Sky if you want to, using GetHash. So what is the motivation for the talk? Coming to my background, I started as a Solaris admin in, I don't know, 1998 or something. I came into the Oracle business and was a DBA for a couple of years and ended up in an open source company like, I don't know, 18 years ago now. And there's a high chance I'll retire there because I really love the job, what we are doing. Another thing is I'm old, and being old is not a quality, it's more like a quantity, of course. But in this industry, we have a very high talent that every 10 years we come up with the same old thing, sell it as a new product and forget everything we learned and start all over. So you get an interesting perspective. After a couple years, you think, I've heard of this something, and you talk to like a 20-year-old person, this is all new, load balancing. It's, yeah, we had this 15 years ago, but this was not Go, it was written in C++, but it worked the same way. And I'm still curious about technology, and even if I have done too much to do with technology on the day-to-day basis, we want to do great stuff and great technology. So looking back and driving back a little bit, at this time, what kind of technology had we, which is now 25, 27 years ago, it was in the department I worked. We were let's say we were the hipster department in the company I worked at this time. There was like the host, IBM, and then there were the hipster newbies working with some Linux, but more like Solaris, HPX. At the time, I worked for a big German retailer. It was like the European Amazon at the time. They are bankrupt now, but at the time they were a big deal. And we pretty much had these technology options. So we could go for Solaris or HPX to solve our problems. We had big goals. Like the web was coming up, e-commerce was coming up, so the demand for new technology and speed and improvement to the traditional IT we had at this time were tremendous. So we really had to adjust the way we deliver software, we build software and run it in a totally different way than the old, like let's say, host procedures we had at the time was like more like a long-term and very static process. And what we wanted is we wanted to have like a good architecture, of course. So we had to consider like how we can do high availability, how we can do scaling and all that stuff in the web, which a lot of the fundamental technology you get out of the box today was not available. So that is what we wanted, to make great architecture. And everything we could do at the time was like going to our vendors we had at this time. It was pretty much Sun, Microsystems and HP, and say, okay, we need this and this. Surprisingly, they had a very good product to solve our problem. So yeah, no problem, you can use this whatever suite, install it, it will fix it. And so whatever problem we had, it seemed to be there's like a proprietary product out there which can provide the solution. But even if we wanted like this, usually we ended up in like this one. So it never worked. So we get a problem, buy this product, like 20,000 euros, and then you were ready to run. But every time it never worked. So it was a big disappointment. And the supposed improvement always made it worse. So every time we try to improve and work with the software, and so it's so bad that there's a German word for this. It's like Verschlimmbesserung, which is exactly saying if you want to improve it, make it work. This is the perfect word in German to describe it. You can forget it immediately or you can memorize it because it's pretty helpful. So ending up, it was super frustrated. We were very limited to the stack. We couldn't go out and get something new, so it was very frustrating trying to innovate and improve, but in very strong boundaries. And so what changed at the time was already there, of course, with HPX and Solaris, was there were new standards coming in place. POSIX was there, like POSIX described like the fundamental things, how we work on a like Linux or Unix system, or basic commands like AWK or SED or LS. So there was kind of a standardization coming up. And that was a change to the way we worked. Linux was coming in, GNU tools were coming in, so it really changed in a couple of years at this time, like the 2000s, more and more stuff coming up. Like older people remember the first Linux distributions where you were more or less like a disc jockey installing the different DVDs to get the right package installed. But I remember back the first time the amazing catalog of software you had and could install, because in the Solaris world there was something like, somebody worked with you with Solaris? I was all too young. Okay, the old like Sun freeware or so, if you can remember, where you get like new tools pre-compiled. And that was something that was really new because we were able to really get like a big world of software. And also I remember in this Solaris and HPX team I worked, then there was like a Linux guy coming in, and then we totally moved in the other role that this guy was the hipster, and we said, no, you cannot do with Linux. And we ended up that we had like a 40,000 euro Solaris machine in the data center, which is supposed to run our e-commerce shop, but honestly, it ran on his desktop under Linux in his office. That was like the production system, because we never get to work the other system that the load balancing worked. So we drove it on Linux, and we told no one, but that is what worked. And we used the other Solaris machine for CT at home to get up and listening for Extra Live. What also interesting to worth that money. But it was way more interesting because we get also from the company, we had like outreach, talking to other communities. It was just a great time. And there was also a lot of more diversity in the software stack, working with other people. So it really changed the way we can move forward with the system. And it was just fantastic, because at the time, it was really in a couple of years a different way from working and innovating in IT, because of open standardization, working with other people and having a community. So time flies. So where we are now. I would say it's not so worse. The current status is, let's say it's different. We have a lot of open source, a lot of passion in the IT industry, of course, means you are all here, we are all here for an open source summit here in Bangkok to in some way embrace the open source and community work. We have more open source than ever. So if you pretty much every second slide deck shows some GitHub statistic, how many like projects there are, how many stars and contributors. So is a lot going on. We see a big movement, of course, to the public cloud and hybrid cloud. This is a pretty current numbers, like about 3 months old or so. What we see is that we have a dramatic shift, or let's say, Alice should decide if it's dramatic, but we have a great shift from having on-premise installations going to a hybrid public cloud environment. But I think there's a problem with it. And I would like to pretty much share my thinking and my idea about where we can improve as an industry and can perhaps try to make it better. So first of all, open source is not an open standard, because it's often misused that people say it's all open, but that doesn't mean that it's still open source. It's not an open standard, because a standardized way, and I know it has this, there are challenges with an open standard, because the biggest challenge with having an open standard is that it's slow. It takes some time to establish a standard, because you have discussed what is the best, like I'm talking about a JSON or XML. It takes many years to come up with a standard, how to work with it. But if you think about all the IT stuff you have now, the standardized stuff you work with, you pretty much will learn after a couple of years that the standardized things survive and the other things disappear. So if you want to do something and you try to not learn so much in the future, do something with SQL, you will get a job in 20 years still using SQL. Every 5 years somebody will come up and say document database is the new hot thing, SQL is dead, and in 5 years SQL will still be there. So that's like a standardized way to query databases, and perhaps it sounds to someone super boring, and for others it's a great thing, but you can get an SQL job in 20 years from now, I promise, because it's a standardized way to query data, and it's super smart, it's good, it's fast, and it has one of the superpowers, because it's a standardized way. You can pretty much work on all like ANSI compatible database and do your basic queries and get data out of it. Another thing is that an API is not an open standard. Because often, and of course having an API is super important to work with it, just because a product, a provider, or a tool has an API doesn't mean it's a standard. Perhaps it's a standard way to query something using like a REST or and getting some JSON information, but itself it's not an open standard. So we have a very unbalanced market in there. And if you remember, I had this picture before with Solaris HPX, which is, of course, was not a true picture. This is a true picture. A couple of years ago from the Seattle airport, where you have an unbalanced market, and this is my perspective on this. You have this like going the Microsoft way or the Amazon way. My old friend Taros. It's nothing against Amazon because you asked me yesterday. And you have the other terminals you go into, right? So we have a very unbalanced market, and we can also see that in the numbers that they're pretty much, and if you remember these like hybrid and public cloud movement, pretty much the whole market is distributed to a couple of providers. It's like AWS and Azure leading the race, of course. It's like Google, IBM, Oracle, a little bit like Alibaba, but compared to the others, it's a pretty dominant and a pretty unbalanced, also like geographically and political unbalanced market, which I see is a problem. And that is also a problem having to do with interoperability and standards. So there's a strong relation in my opinion. And there's no real standards. So in this cloud world, for instance, there are standards which have somebody have heard of you of like OCCI and OVF? This is like a cloud standard. It's there for 10 years, nobody knows it. It's like a standard how, it's like open cloud computing interface, I guess, is OCCI, or OVF is used like on VirtualBox and open virtualization. It's all standards, but nobody knows about these standards because pretty much no providers does care about it. And what we see that people try to overcome this non-standardized way to talking to products and providers is they use something else. Because of course you have like your own independent API to talk to your cloud provider, to your own infrastructure at home, but more or less people using some middleware, using Terraform or OpenTofu or Red Hat Ansible to work with the infrastructure, creating kind of, and even this is not like a real standard from, I don't know, WRC consortium or something, but it's kind of an industry standard to get you multiple providers into like an abstraction layer. This is why they are so important. Another thing is Kubernetes. It's also not a standard, seeing it from the standard perspective, but it's a good way in creating interoperability, taking your Kubernetes stuff from one provider to another, going from on-premise to public or hybrid or back and forth. I'm not real expert. I understand, of course, Kubernetes, but I'm not willing to say that's the best way to do it. But the kind of abstraction that Kubernetes provides you, I think, is a good way to create kind of an abstraction layer. Still, it's also like a standard in that universe, not over all the other infrastructure providers out there. But it's still a good way now to create some layer in between if you use like others. So what's the impact on open source? What does it mean? So there is a good and evil. Playing with open source and keeping open source community alive in the way like providers and platform providers work with open source software they use and provide it to the customer. But it changes the way how open source providers can work. And there's what we see in the market is there's a lot of like fear and protection that a lot of open source software providers come up with their own like server-side licenses, like permitting others to use their software in the infrastructure of a service context. So we have new licenses coming up, which is just a how to say it? It's just a way to figure out where I can still make money with my product because my revenue stream is cut off. So imagine that in a cloud, in an open source business model way, typically you have like a full open source, you have like an open core, or you have some models you sell, or you sell support. A lot of open source companies, if someone has seen the opening keynote from Frank yesterday in the morning, like if you don't have an open core model, you're pretty much as an open source provider, you live from the support. You live from that some companies give you money to support you and get support. But if your product is sold by another entity and you don't have this contact and relationship with your customer, it's super hard to also create a revenue stream for you. So open source and standards need support. So most of the open source, let's say open source products you use in an enterprise or company context is not done by private people. I don't want to say that there's not a lot of private effort and people working, but all the professional enterprise open source software is backed up traditionally by companies. They are these very small like libraries and things. My colleague mentioned before that some guy in Nebraska is maintaining something for 20 years which nobody knows, absolutely. But the whole majority of software is maintained by companies, and they need your money to support open source and open standards, even if you buy like a subscription or you buy a support contract by an open source provider. It's just we need it to pay the people. So what does it mean and where the impact for the future in that? So honestly, of course, I don't know. We see that everything is as a service. Whatever you can imagine as a service will be there and is there now. So we moving to definitely, or we are in a service landscape, and this is true for a business level, but this is also true for a private level. People, industries are used to it to pay a monthly bill to get their stuff, even if it's like music, where the old ones were addicted to collect all their CDs at home, or their DVDs if you're a movie collector, but we are used to it. So we pay a monthly fee to get our music, watch our videos, get our cloud infrastructure. That's the new normal. And so there's a question, isn't it all commodities now? So shouldn't it be like concerned or worried that this is like unbalanced because it's just like the new normal to consume like infrastructure or consume software or consume infrastructure? I would say yes, you can see it from this way. But if you talk about like commodity, and this is often an example of like how cloud or how infrastructure or traffic is like commodity, that water and electricity is too, you see, which is not true in real life because it very depends on the place you live on Earth. It's like water is really a right or is a commodity to access water. Like Leicester is very famous, like pumping out Africa with water and selling, like they're pumping out about 50,000 liters an hour of water, and it's crazy expensive to buy a bottle of water in South Africa. And they have a lot of water, but it's like pumped out and sold everywhere else. And so it's totally changing the commodity right to water. Or we see the same with electricity, like the gas price. It means, of course, like living in Europe or getting to know about the war in Ukraine, you know what this spike is coming up. I mean, we in Germany, a lot of the success we had economically in the last century was based on cheap energy we bought from Russia. Wherever you see it, but it changed the way that energy is get crazy expensive, and all the industrial nations have to find a way of getting energy cheaper for the consumer, for the industry, making the shift to renewable energy as well. There's a challenge, but my point in this is not like the energy politics. It's more like that it's not so commodity. It depends on international trade. It depends on providers, and the market is also very strongly controlled on one hand, but there's also a very limited number of people who can provide these natural and resources, which can provide you gas or oil. This is not like you can buy it everywhere. So you are very limited. There's like an oligopoly situation on this. So is it all bad? I would say perhaps. This is of course not all bad because it's like it's changing. But as also I see that all the things are coming in our field, in our technology world. There's a lot of things which are way better than 20, 25 years ago because we have learned to collaborate more open, also collaborate over company borders together, which is a great innovation. And coming with this, I get it that convenience, of course, could be a risk. So if you use your iPhone or your Mac, which I do too, there's some convenience because you are trapped in this Apple ecosystem. And I love it, it's wonderful. You take a picture here, you have it there, you write a note here, it's synchronized, you get a phone call, it's on your Mac, it's super great. I love it from the usability point of view. On the other hand, I see that all my money is sunk there, and if I at one point decide to drop out of the Apple universe, so all my money is gone. Everything I bought there I cannot use anymore because it's just in there. So it's a risk I'm willingly to take, but it's there. Login is a risk. So if you log into some specific technology or non-open standard, it is of course a risk, which is definitely also a risk you often have to take, and I'm also say sometimes you need to take it, but it's important that you are aware of that you are logging into something, some product, some provider, some governmental restriction which could happen in the future, and you take this risk. And to see it from the other side, of course, slowness is a risk too. So if you come up with a great business idea and say, I would like to, I don't know, create the next, I don't know, food delivery app, we have a great idea in mind. Of course you don't hire like 10 engineers, build your data center, buy 20 servers. You get some infrastructure as a service and try to be very fast in that market, and I totally get it. So first thing is, for all the user using public and hybrid cloud, the priority cloud cost optimization, priority number one is cloud cost optimization. So cloud cost is a really big topic, and if you have ever been to like a KubeCon, it's crazy that you have like the 20 world best cloud cost optimization companies out there. This is like a crazy big market of companies who help you reducing the cloud cost. So this is the big thing. Pricing in a market which is unbalanced has also his downsides. Let's say it this way. And I take insulin because it's just a great example what pricing could mean. So a dose of insulin in the US, and this is just a good example, in 2006 cost about $67. In 2022 it was about $500. So what it means that in the insulin production to overcome like diabetes, there's pretty much no innovation in the last 15 years. So the insulin you get now is pretty much the same you get 15 years ago, but there are only 3 companies provided. So there's a very dense, there's pretty much no market. There's like an oligopoly, which companies provide this insulin. The inventor of insulin sold it for $1 to a university at the time. And this only changed like I guess in 2023, there was like the Build Back Better from Joe Biden, which reduced the cost of insulin to maximum $35, which is now. So there was a political influence and lawmaking process required to bring the price down, that people don't die because they were not able to afford a super cheap medicine, which is super easy to produce, but it was got out of control because the free market does not work in that way. And I think we have to make clear that the abuse of power does not come with a surprise. So if you have a very unbalanced market and you have no open standards and you are locked into a specific thing, you cannot wonder at some day and wake up and says, I didn't know that, I couldn't anticipate that this could happen. So what I would bring up with my talk is the idea of thinking about what we are doing. And I'm often worried if you talk to people who say what they do, how they run for infrastructure, and there's a lot of great examples of big German companies I know. They sold their whole data centers, went to a cloud provider, and surprisingly after 2 years they rented their own data centers back because they figured out they have so much legacy crap which is not built for running into a cloud, because it's just like old software which you cannot put easily into a container because it's some specific for the industry. So then you don't have to be surprised that it does not work. And I would encourage you to think about how you work with this. So if you enter a market, if you enter your login or you enter a specific vendor, think about what open standard is important for you and open interface is important for you to be independent. Also being political independent is something which worries me. This is, of course, you know, a sheep from Venezuela. And there was an act, I think it was 2019 that, and I just would take it as an example, that American companies were not allowed legally to provide services in Venezuela. Which means if you were in Venezuela and have you like a marketing agency and had all your stuff in the Adobe cloud, you were not able to access all your media and creative data from one day to another because the lawmakers decided not to do so for whatever reason. I don't want to judge if the reason was good or fair. I'm just want to bring up what that it could mean, that you have your data in the cloud and from one day to another you cannot access it. And that's crazy. And means even we have, let's say the political situation got more crazy in the last months. Let's say it this way. Okay, Taurus has no idea what I'm talking about. But the world is, I would say it's more unstable than it was 10 years ago. And I think we can perhaps agree on this. And nobody knows what's happened tomorrow. Means the worst thing is that champagne is get 200% more expensive in the US. This would hit me hard. Happily, I'm not drinking champagne and I live in Germany, but anyway, that is perhaps not a serious problem, but if you run an infrastructure somewhere, that could be a problem. So what can you do? Perhaps you don't follow every hype, which is, by the way, I think it's always a great thing to follow not the hottest big shit immediately, but perhaps the library or framework disappears tomorrow. So often, perhaps it makes sense to wait some time. I have to hurry up. Nobody really cares if you don't go to the party. I know we have these like FOMO that we have to be part of something. We need, of course, to buy crypto because everybody is else getting rich with it. We need to use that framework because it's the new shit I need for my resume. But perhaps it makes sense sometimes to step back, look on infrastructure, look on the way you work with IT. And sometimes you just can take more time. Unfortunately, the QR link does not work anymore. But the blog post you can find is very interesting. It's the blog post of the Prime Video team, how they reduced the cost about 90%. You can find it on Google. If you say like Prime Video reducing costs, they went back from like a microservice infrastructure point of view to like a super boring virtual machine infrastructure. And they saved 90% of their money, just going back to a very old fart paradigm of running IT. Of course not hip, but they figured out that they were mostly produce costs moving the data from A to B and B to C and then back, and that just went back to a very lame old infrastructure, and it saved them a lot of money. And there's a lot of examples out there. Cost control. I don't know why people go to a cloud and then start with cost control. So you can start with cost control even if you are on premise or if you're hybrid. It makes sense to figure out, do we really need these resources? But often in like an enterprise context, it's okay, we have this infrastructure, we have to provide it. Perhaps there's some billing internally, but it's pretty much, we need it. So we fire up all these virtual machines nobody knows we need it for. So there's something you can work on in your infrastructure. Be reasonable, what you use, how to use it. Of course, make sure that your infrastructure interoperability is supported by your providers. Try to prevent a vendor login, which is hard because I remember my own sentence, like using an Apple or using whatever software out there. We always logged in, but it's something you can wrap your mind around it. Support the variety. So support different providers, support the small companies which put a lot of efforts into open source, and even the big brands support open source in a very important way. I want to make this clear, but support the variety of providers and builders and creators out there is important, and it's up to us. Demand contribution. So your provider, your whatever company and supply use, demand that they contribute upstream, that if they improve the software for you, they improve it for everyone else because you participate in the next level with it. Sometimes doubt if it sounds too good. Perhaps sleep about it another night and think about it again. And we as an industry are responsible for having a diverse software environment, having a diverse field of innovation, but we're also responsible for having a diverse field of providers, a diverse field of infrastructure as a service. And also we have the responsibility that a small company is able to enter that market. And if you would like to be an internet provider nowadays, and you say, okay, tomorrow I invest all the money I saved for the last 10 years, I'm going to be an internet provider. It's super hard because try to buy IP addresses. It's super hard. It means IPv6, no problem, but try to buy IP version 4 IP addresses. it's super hard because they're all gone. And all the IP addresses nobody needed, they're also gone because somebody else was smart enough to buy them a couple of years. So it's pretty impossible to enter that market, and it's up to us to create that freedom. And that's it. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There.
Have a question?
We don't really have time, but if there's any urgent, yes? We can have just one quick one.
Do you see a big difference between public infrastructure and business or private infrastructure? Can you repeat the question as well?
I try to repeat the question if I see a difference between public infrastructure and private infrastructure. I would say yes, because the big difference is driving, let's say driving like an open standard private infrastructure is super hard. So for instance, we drive our cloud of an open stack, but it takes many years to really, means all the software is out there, like there's a Ceph for storage and networking, all this stuff, but you need a lot of expertise. And I get it as a company, if you see, I need a private cloud. Means even I have an open source and open standard hard, I would say perhaps we should consider buying VMware because it's expensive, but then we can start in a month. You cannot start with an open stack in a month. It's pretty much, I would say it's impossible. So that's a big difference. And in the public cloud, it's of course a way of considering which provider you choose. And I think the big difference if you are on, and I keep it quick, okay? If you use on a standard level in a public cloud, let's say you are on a level of infrastructure as a service, it's still, I wouldn't say easy, but it's quite good possible to move from one provider to another. So adjust your Terraform and start up the machines, not at Amazon, just as Google or somewhere else. But when it gets really hard, if you get to the next level, like function as a service, Lambda or AI, which is super heavily bound to that provider, it's honestly, it's quite impossible to move from one provider to another. So if you decide, and I want to make it clear again, it's a decision you can make as a company because you need it, we want to be fast, we have to decide to go with one framework. And going on the application level in a multi-cloud provider strategy is really, really hard. But to be honest, then you are in. You are trapped. You have to go with this provider where the provider goes, if it's legally allowed to serve you, wherever the pricing goes, that's it. Private, you still can choose another provider or buy VMware and hire 10 people and build up your open stack to use it in production in 5 years. And that's the big difference, I guess. There's a way out.
Thank you very much. And the conversations can continue in the hallway track. Next up, we have Nils Magnus. Are you here, Nils? I have not seen Nils. You're not Nils. Okay. Well, maybe Nils is stuck in traffic. Okay. So maybe he's not here. So if you want, we can continue the conversation if anyone would like to continue with ERC. Otherwise, we can break.
Yes, you can. So Tower is working for AWS open source. We can have a conversation.
We can. So let's do that. Just for everyone's information, the next session will be at sorry, at 10:45 a.m. Yes. So yes, sir. So if you can please come on, take a microphone.
Can I just add to my question?
Yeah.
It was a completely different question I wanted to ask.
Okay, that's then all my answer was bad.
You join in.
No, I mean, do you see a difference between public infrastructure in terms of infrastructure which is provided by taxpayers' money
Yeah.
and private infrastructure which is by consumers or companies paid by their privately driven sales decision or buying decision?
But what do you mean with like public infrastructure paid by taxpayers?
So should a state,
Yeah.
Should a state, if they make buying decisions of infrastructure for services they provide as digital infrastructure to their citizen,
Yeah.
should they think definitely different than a private company which is offering services to other private companies or consumers?
I think so, because as like a normal private company, of course it's up to you which like work ethic or supplier regulations you have. But I think as a government, like spending taxpayers' money, you have a specific responsibility. So I think, for instance, there's one thing seeing it from the open source perspective, that there's these I don't know, public code, public money, public code. That is once you can see it if the taxpayer invests money, then it needs to be public. Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. So that is one perspective, and also I think the government has a responsibility perhaps to make sure if the government spends money that the company we spend the money for pays taxes. So that's another perspective, and it's different in the world, I get it, but also in Europe this is a very common thing that money is like double Dutch transferred from one company to another, and at the end no revenue is left and nobody's paying taxes. And if I take it as a practical example, if the Deutsche Bahn, the German railway, decides we sell all our data centers and go to a public cloud provider, I think the government, because we still own the German railway, has a responsibility to make sure that they pay the fair share. And honestly, I'm wondering, we are like a 95 people company. We get on a regular basis, get tax control every 4 to 5 years. And they count down how many backpacks we bought for the Christmas party, right? If we bought too many backpacks and if the backpack was more than 35 euros because then you overcome the tax limit, you're often wondering that some other people don't pay any taxes and overcome this. So this really pisses me off, to be honest, if I think about it. So that's unfair, and yes, the government has a responsibility to decide differently. Perhaps we can follow up later, or I don't know how much time.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to make a comment about the standards and to kind of call for a point that I work for Eclipse Foundation, and I will be talking a little bit later about Jakarta E, and that is about specification and standards. And that is something that users have to demand, not to be locked into a certain provider, and to request standards, whether it is in enterprise Java or it's cloud infrastructure. I think part of the creating a standards, which is slow, and as some popular speakers like to refer to them about being boring, but boring in a good sense, boring being predictable, being reliable, and having a job in 20 years, because whoever started, if you did, with the Java EE once upon a time, or Java, you're still very employable. And we're just, evolving. So anything in cloud infrastructure still needs to be standardized, but it will only happen if there is a strong request from the end user who is using the infrastructure. That's the comment that I was trying to make.
But I totally agree. Means that was my example, like people using some Terraform to create these standardized level. We see the same with all the AI movement, right? In the European Union, we try to regulate how we work with AI, but this is a big challenge for us as an industry to have a standardization, have a fair use policy, or whatever you name it. But on the other hand, it cannot cost us 20 years, because then everything else is gone. Because we have the talent to still discuss things, and the real life happens while we're doing it. And it's also a challenge. But I don't know, Taras, if you want to comment on it. Because I have a microphone, I think.
No, it's fine. I agree with what folks are saying. Being in the U.S., we don't really have this idea of public infrastructure. And things are changing very rapidly. Exactly.
You are the inventor of the internet, which was public infrastructure, right?
So,
Paid by taxpayers' money.
it was, but we got to get up here. I don't want to get up here.
You're welcome.
Thank you. This is Bernd. I've known Bernd for 20 years, so I just came to hear his talk. But no, I think that, and these are just my opinions, not my employer's opinions, but one of the things I love about open source is this idea that you can have sovereignty over your own data. As Frank was talking about, I use Nextcloud every day. I use the app I really like is a newsreader. I'm old, okay? You mentioned blogs, you know? It's like, I'm old, I have a blog. There was this thing called Really Simple Syndication, RSS, that enabled you to see everything. And when Google killed Google Reader, they basically invented social media. But I do think that, that in any country, you need to consider where your data is living. If I remember correctly, I don't know where we stand right now, but the EU had reached an agreement with the United States about allowing data to be hosted in U.S. data centers as long as there was an oversight committee. And I think that oversight committee just got dissolved. Yes. And so I remember in Brussels, they were talking about, you know, what are the next steps after that.
There was this privacy shield,
yeah,
which was enabled, but they destroyed it.
Yeah.
And there's like the Cloud Act on the other side, where like now the European German perspective is under GDPR, if it's like hosted in Europe, it's still GDPR compliant because the data is there. On the other hand, there's like lawmaking process in the US that the Cloud Act enables the company in the US need to have access in the cloud overseas. So it's like you can see it from both ways.
Yeah, I think we're going to move into a much more federated model. I mean, Amazon, my employer, AWS, has data centers all over the world, and you can at the moment limit yourself to those data centers, but like you mentioned, there is the ability to shed data to other data centers, so there's a bunch of extra steps.
Yes.
But yeah, we're in an interesting crossroads. I hope it works out okay. But one of the things I love about open source is this idea. Like I recently, for reasons, changed my blog from WordPress to Hugo. First of all, I didn't need WordPress. I mean, I didn't. A static site generator like Hugo was fine. But I ended up having to go through about 1,500 blog posts. And what was interesting was now they're in Markdown. And everybody reads Markdown. Like I'll never have to rewrite them again because I'm not a programmer, so I was on Amazon Q every day asking Q to write scripts to help me convert because Hugo has a translator from WordPress, but it's not perfect. And so we needed to go and edit out some of the HTML that survived the transition and everything. And I just feel better that my data is now in Markdown.
It's a standard.
It's a standard.
Yeah.
And so I think really looking standards. I mean, before coming to AWS, I ran an open source project for 20 years, and it was a Java app. And it was one of those things. It's even though there's all these new fancy languages and stuff like that. I mean, I'm trying to get my brain around Python, and I'm like, wait, if you have a syntax error, you won't find it until execution. And that freaks me out because I used to compile everything because I fat finger everything and it would mess up. But getting back to the question at hand, I think open source is going to play a huge role in that data sovereignty. And you can go and look at options, even on the cloud. You know, you had the slide up here which said very few people are pure cloud, very few people are pure on-prem, and 73%, I think it was, are some sort of hybrid. And I think that's where you're going to go, where you're going to have your most sensitive information you'll probably keep very close to your chest, and the information that isn't as sensitive will be out there. And just to put in a plug for my employer, we are working very, very hard to make sure that our customers, I've never worked for a company that was more customer focused, and I ran a company, you know, so we're trying to make sure that our customers, you know, are protected and that their data is protected and their company is protected too. But as the situation is changing very, very rapidly right now, you know, I would love any kind of feedback as far as any issues folks see with that. But it is kind of weird for me to, not being in Europe, this idea of actually having the government do cool things. Because, you know, that was one of the things that we're regretting now is there was data.gov. The United States published a lot of government data in a standard that you could access.
It's removed now?
They're getting rid of it. And now we have archive.org, so again, being open source, there are people who are scrambling to save that information and host it elsewhere. So we'll find a way. And if all we had was Microsoft Windows or Solaris, we wouldn't be doing this. And now that we have Linux and we have PostgreSQL, because there's a whole PostgreSQL thing here, that really makes it very strong. And I think that's going to be the key to the freedom. Anyway, that's just, thanks, Bernd. I didn't.